So I'm from, yeah, Emily, you forgot to record. so, so I come from an area, I live most of my life in Boston, Massachusetts. And Boston has a decent sized Latino population, but not a very big Mexican population. So like anti-Mexican slurs were not part of my life until I moved to Los Angeles, in which I watched a driver pull over on the side of the road to scream at Mexican laborers. And I was shocked, right? That wasn't part of the community in which I grew up. And I was teaching all Mexican American kids. I knew something differently about these kids' lives, having seen and understood some of what they were working up against. So the patterns of inclusion and exclusion in the community matter too, right? Forget a school I was once working with, they said, how come nobody gives us a chart like this for every one of our students? I would say we need to start to build our own mental chart like this, or a great classroom exercise is to have kids start to build these out as a way to think about their own identity. I use these charts actually to explore literature with young people, right? When they start to look at a character, starting to think about who they are in the center and help them map out their environment around them. Helping make that stuff visible will help students think very carefully about the communities in which they live and how they're being supported and where their challenges and obstacles that they run into. And so this makes me think, I'm going to steal a little bit from my colleague Carola Suarez Orozco. I'm throwing in a little kind of psychology of immigrant kids work, because Carola's good at this and I'm good at imitating her. So she said it's really important when we're thinking about immigrant kids that what are their stories and how are they similar and different than other kids who may be in marginalized communities. So this is her words, but not mine, but useful, I think. I think it's important to think that, with other marginalized communities, often there's an overlap in parent education and work conditions, right? This is massive generalizations here, but there may be overlap in difficult work conditions or people working many extra hours. In some marginalized communities, poverty is part of the story, right? And racialization, right? So very quickly, anybody from people from almost any visible minority community becomes racialized in the United States, right? This is part of the way that we deal with others. Black immigrants become treated as African Americans in this society very quickly, right? Which is a different experience. But what's different than people from other marginalized communities? Think about the challenges of language acquisition sitting on top of some of these issues, or just these newcomer status, and thinking about the social and emotional challenges of trying to find your way into a new community. And increasingly and often quite specific xenophobia, targeting particular groups. Again, I'm saying other groups are racialized. I'm just suggesting that there's a generalized xenophobia that we see growing right now. And then there are, for some folks in uncertain legal status, even if you've come here with every single document and filled out every single legal form. I don't know how many of you have ever come to the United States and tried to get your green card or permanent citizenship. That's a legal battle unto itself, regardless of how you came into this country. I use my brother-in-law as an example, who they didn't believe he was married to my sister, right? And you can imagine the challenges that was set off in the family. So, and if it's not the kids, it's their family struggling with this. So again, sorry, Sarabeth trying to negotiate where I'm putting the pictures. So what are some of the other challenges that might be specific to immigrant origin kids? The stress and the trauma of migration, whether that's pre-migratory, during the voyage, or after, right? Sometimes it's about, I'll get back to there, and sometimes it's about reunification with family based on people's different histories, right? The culture shock, when you end up in one place where the rules and behaviors and expectations were one thing and you find out it's not this way. And that doesn't happen all in one day. That's like something that it's a constant learning, right? How to negotiate culture. And then, there's the acquisition of academic language, right? We know that learning out, you guys know this better than I do, it takes a long time to acquire academic language. Kids might speak English first, but academic language is something else. And then there's the judgments that come with the way that people speak, right? I mean, we know this even from folks born in this country. And again, I'll use Boston. Bostonians don't sound so good in the rest of the country, right? Y'all judge us. Sorry. What if, the issues around family? I mentioned family separations and reunifications. About 80% of immigrant youth have had some family separation at some point of their experience. When, we've talked in the last couple of years about the government's role in that, but even before the government's role, like, one family member goes early or one family member goes later, or maybe both parents have gone and the child will come and reunite, right? So and that's not an easy story, again, as some of you know, in ways much deeper than I do. And then there's questions of acculturation, right? There may be different expectations in parents and the kids, because kids are often like the entry point into the United States. And wait, mom and dad may not like that. My colleague is the daughter of a Palestinian immigrant, and she still tells me, God, what is this about Americans and those kids wanting to sleep over at everybody's house? We don't do that. That's not our culture, right? So they're, and she's telling me about how they're battling, but that's part of these negotiations for different expectations. And I mentioned the legal issues. And again, I mentioned the xenophobia earlier. So, but kids are not deficits, right? There's the other part of the story. So again, speaking in broad terms from Carolla's work as a psychologist, it's not my research, hers, but I think you'll recognize this, right? There's an optimism that is part of immigrant experience in the United States, right? People may not have always wanted to come, right? They may have been forced out of their house, but there's an optimism that we're going to be rebuilding our lives, right? So with that, often is a story of a very, very deep work ethic, right? That's part of family work ethics. Sometimes the expectations of work end up crossing over into school with expectations that kids may be, earning money financially, but there's a work ethic there. There's in many cases, you really talk to parents and there's a deep value of education, right? If for many people, it's part of the reason that they brought their kids to the United States in the first place, right? And many people made huge sacrifices for their own lives and their own careers, right? People who would quite successful in some positions end up in the United States in a much less I don't know. It's 7:00 and my brain is already tired, but less high status position. But then but the belief is that the kids will make it, and then put pressure on kids to make it in particular career pathways too. But remember the advantages of bilingualism. Again, you all know this, but I think it's important because I bet your colleagues don't. So how do we think about the real advantages, in terms of family communication, and kids who are bilingual become those links, right? I don't know how many of you have kids who really are the kind of the entry point into US culture. I heard many stories from the educators I was working with, how their kids became the translators during COVID, helping take the information that was coming from the government around about health issues, right? So that's just one entry area. But also in the workplace, the advantages of being bilingual, right? The advantages, especially in certain industries where highly immigrant communities, folks who can speak multi-languages end up being really, really key members of a community. My wife tells me about being a translator at a framing shop in Orange County, California, because she grew up speaking Spanish, and became the mediator, and and moved up because of that. And then it turns out there's some social emotional advantages, right? Because if you're code switching all the time, you start to think a little bit about how should I be in the presence of this space, right? So you start to think about regulation of behavior differently. So there's also this cognitive flexibility and perspective taking skills that are built up along the way. So I hope my version of Carolla's talk didn't bore you, but I think that information I think is useful. So let me push us on as we start to think about what else we could do. School contexts really matter. What's very interesting is that you probably have seen this. EL kids are typically isolated from their native born peers. This is a problem, especially when you're starting to look at kids who want to speak English, because being around native born peers who are friends makes a huge difference. So isolation works against what we're trying to do sometimes. This also, I find some of this is troubling, that there's often a real educator disconnect from newcomer students. So in general, the research Corolla has done over the years says educators often really like newcomer students, but they really have very low expectations of them. They may think that they're these great kids, but don't want to push them too hard because, oh, they've already been through enough. That's a problem. That's a problem. I mean, again, the personal stories. I was teaching at a really wonderful high school. I mentioned this on Twitter last week. And one of these kids came up to me, as a kid from Guatemala, said, well, actually, it's a kid from Brazil. And she's like, in Brazil, I was like reading philosophy books, and here they're giving me Jack and Jill. And she felt really insulted. She said she's like, I don't want to do any of this work. It's so stupid. So how do we balance that, right? And how do we scaffold the information so the kids actually can feel like they're being pushed? They want to be pushed, I think, a lot of them. And I think there's a real limited understanding of the social and emotional challenges that immigrants are navigating. That's why I think some of that background that I just shared, it's why I was sharing it. And this really, really bothers me, and I'm sure you've seen it. A lot of teachers who may like kids have often expressed real poor opinions of immigrant parents. And some of it comes down to misunderstanding, and some of it is about prejudice. Sometimes it's, oh, I can never reach the parents when I need to reach them, not understanding, work schedule issues. But sometimes it's really prejudice. We live in a society in which xenophobia is in the air. It's hard not to breathe it in, right? And then just about all educators have not really received professional development that's broader about the whole child when we're thinking about immigrant kids. So some of the things that we've been doing to try to address these issues is we created a guide that we called Moving Stories, which is a really simple way to engage kids in sharing their stories. And it's built in a way for people to interview each other in an equal status relationship. Actually, Emily interviewed me because we had a technology failure in a workshop. And it's wonderful. I think it's one of the things I love in the power dynamic is a lot of times kids whose families came into the country a while ago, like mine, end up thinking, wow, that's so cool that they know stuff. I don't know anything. And so it kind of flips the script in a way. It's a wonderful resource. It's very simple to implement. It's free, download it from the website. It's probably my favorite exercise to do with young people if I only have one thing to do in a school. The other thing I think is really, really important, another issue, and the other categories are going to take far less time than where I started. It's really important that you ensure in and out groups. I mean, ensure safety and inclusion. And that means really mapping the in and out groups at a school and think each community has its own way of defining in and out groups. Again, ways that may not be obvious. I was teaching all Mexican-American kids. The kids who are from Oaxaca were treated really badly. That was not something I was aware of when I walked into the classroom. It's something that took a while to start to understand. So start to listen for that, right? Notice the way that the students and the faculty talk about and respond to immigrants and other kids, right? And people who are perceived as newcomers, because that means you may have to intervene. And that means sometimes you may have to intervene even in the way that another faculty member is talking to kids, right? The big stories, I won't name the high school I was teaching at where teachers commonly would try to stop people from speaking Spanish at lunch, right? And kids felt fairly demeaned. So think about, when do you need to intervene from peers? When do you need to push your faculty members as well? So, 82% of school administrators found that students had made discriminatory remarks about other racial ethnic groups. 68% of those schools, white majority schools, reported anti-immigrant harassment. We know that many of those schools weren't reporting it because only 36% of those same schools were communicating about the need to tolerate or respect immigrant kids. interestingly, when they talked about other issues, like you're supposed to respect people of different racial groups, religious groups, the numbers would be in the 80s that people would communicate about that. But when it came to respecting immigrant kids, the numbers were in the mid 30s. This is a problem, and this has to change, right? We have to make it the norm that immigrant kids are respected, right? It's not a political argument. I said the law is the law. Right. So one of the things that we're doing right now is we're running a free climate survey with a group called Youth Truth for high schools. We have about 4 more slots. If anyone's here at a high school, I would suggest sign up. This is really an amazing opportunity. It's free. We'll give you all amazing professional development afterwards if you're interested in it. Implementing it is really, really easy. But if your school would be interested, people have to sign up by March 10th. So there's a link on our website. If you go, it's immigrants. I mean, it's a students' climate survey. You'll find it on the website. So what else? Make diversity visible. And it's really important where you start in the communities, in the hallways. How is your school communicating who matters, right? So where are we embracing the diversity of languages and identities and family practices in our school communities? Think about like when your school celebrates a holiday. What are the voices? What are the symbols? Who's there? So how do we infuse school rituals and routines that really start to honor the diversity? Where are we displaying messages of inclusion in public spaces? Where are we sharing those stories? So when a parent of a newcomer walks in the building, that they know they matter just as much as everybody else, right? So they don't feel like they're just sneaking in. It may sound token, it really matters. So one thing we've put together based on some research is we put together a kind of a culturally responsive teaching checklist. I'm not the biggest checklist human being, but what we've tried to figure out is how do you take some of that research and make it visible. So what we've been doing is trying to help people think about what does culturally responsive practice look like from a baseline of kind of contributions in which you simply introduce a hero or a holiday to starting to think more and more complicated and deeper ways about how do we use culture as a way to start to think about civic action and perspective taking. So that's all, again, it's another free resource. Just go download it. It's there, it's yours. And one of the things that we just ask people to do is just to start to think, you know, how do I view my students through a deficit lens? How do I think about my students' identities? How do I talk about them? How do I talk about the histories and cultures of groups other than my own? Simple questions, but I think it's useful to have those voices in our ear every once in a while, asking us to think carefully. So I talked about this earlier, but really setting high expectations matters. But doing that in a way that builds upon the knowledge and the language that their students bring with them in the classroom. Think about what they know. How do we help build on the perspectives that they're bringing into the room? You know, I always think that, you know, especially for anyone who's interested in kind of global history, global culture, immigrant kids actually bring in so much, have such an interesting perspective on the United States, right? How do we build on that? So we're a lot of our work is drawn from kind of thinking routines that Project Zero does, our pedagogy. So there are really simple kind of pedagogical interventions, very, very simple, whether it's the way you debrief a document or a short story, that they're tied to certain academic dispositions. So think about how you're using your pedagogy to build a deeper disposition. And so the ones, again, that we've emphasized are really important are perspective taking, inquiry skills, helping students recognize inequities and opportunities to take action. How do we learn to speak across difference? And how do we help young people make it a disposition that when they see inequity, that they recognize it is their responsibility to take action. For us, I think this is broader than ELs, but we need to work to teach about migration across the subjects in a way that both builds common ground, but also builds a deeper understanding of the role that migration has played in this country. We seem to, you know, one of the reasons that we enact the same behaviors, anti-immigrant xenophobia, is because we really don't seem to know very much about our own history. Even folks whose families, 2, 3, 4 generations out, it's very easy to let myth replace the reality. I was just teaching a group of older Jewish adults yesterday, and I shared a story about family negotiating language issues with their parents. The immigrant parents didn't want to speak English. The kids were embarrassed. The adults were fascinated. They said, "Oh, wow, I thought that was just a challenge today. That's fascinating that our family was doing that." It's powerful for kids to know that that's part of our story, right? That's part of the American story. Immigrant kids also love that. It's like, oh, wait, I thought that was just us. So I think that history matters a lot. And so I would also say, instead of ducking these civic issues that become very politicized about immigrants, as people start to think about how, dilemmas around refugees or discussions about DACA, I think I come from an education that values civic education a lot, but I think we need to find ways to talk about these issues. These are very basic civic skills. We can't just avoid these issues. Kids feel it. They feel what's going on in the air, and they want to know, is it safe to talk about it? And can we talk about these issues in a way that are constructive? So I know that that's hard. I know that the environment is difficult right now, but think about ways you get at these issues through short stories or using, current events and using journalism as a way to start to talk about these issues. And I know for EL kids, there's differences and we're going to have to scaffold this stuff, but we have to normalize these conversations. So for me, most important is this recognition that the children of immigrants are much more than English learners, right? I said this earlier, but they bring their identities and their experiences into school. And when we simply judge kids, you guys know this, by language learning, we're making a big mistake. Whether it's a kid's accent or even language, even language proficiency, that's not a fair read of somebody's motivation to learn, or even what they know. And current practice, I will tell you that over 5 years, half of immigrant origin kids academically disengage right now. This is a study from my colleague Carola Suarez Orozco. So that's a disaster. When you have kids who are coming eager to learn, because we know that immigrant kids come into school eager to learn, and yet over 5 years, her research says about half of these kids academically begin to disengage. That's like the exact opposite of what we would want to start to see happen in schools. So current practice is not working. So we've been thinking about what are the dispositions that we need to really cultivate with immigrant kids. So, and this is immigrant kids and everybody. So I'll give you a few to think about, and then I'm winding down, Emily. We're thinking about perspective taking. How do we build inquiry? And so the inquiry reimagining migration cares about is building inquiry around human migration with care and nuance. Like when you hear a stereotype, how do we know to go deeper? You hear the beginning of a story, make it a habit. Don't just rely on what we hear on the surface. A disposition to communicate and build relationships across difference. It's really important to practice that, whether it's political differences, ethnic differences, cultural differences. How do we help students begin to analyze situations so that they recognize power inequities, right? Because it's really easy, especially when you're talking about issues around migration. Oh, my family came and my family did this and my family did that. So my family came to the United States before there were any laws preventing them from actually even coming in terms of any quotas. So don't tell me that this is the same as that. Kids need to look at those two situations and say, well, yes, your family came before this time and there was no law there. So how do we look carefully? And then ultimately, we want a disposition that kids recognize that it's their job to create inclusive, sustainable school environments, communities. But let the habits begin in schools. How we helping kids begin to develop their own civic identities by being more welcoming to the next newcomer, right? And how we creating communities where kids take action and take their responsibility to be the ambassadors for their peers. So we look at these issues we have a learning arc, which is our way of starting to think about how you organize this stuff by teaching through curriculum. reminder, we think teaching through past and through literature is really powerful. When I'm thinking about culturally responsive teaching, I'm not just saying that every book has to be a story about every kid's matching their particular experience, but being very intentional about thinking about how when is this a mirror of one's own experience, and when is it a window into a new opportunity. I think one of the most powerful things that we can do as educators is help them realize somebody else's story can be both a window and a mirror for them too. I'm not saying not to teach their stories. Representation matters a lot, but it's really powerful when you see yourself in somebody else's story, whether it's a past or another piece of literature. And then I love when we're teaching stories, again, representation does matter a lot. So when we're teaching stories about civics, one of the big civic education challenges that people keep on saying, what do you do with undocumented kids or kids who are not going to become citizens with civic education? I would say there are more amazing stories of young immigrant activism that are so often left out of what people teach. Nudge the civics teachers, or take it on yourselves. The picture I have here is one of my favorite stories for the last few years. These are 15 young women from Texas who organized a protest against a law that they perceived as racial profiling. And so what they did is they took a cultural tradition. They took the idea of the quinceañera and sort of created a mock quinceañera on the steps of the Texas Capitol. And they ended up 15 young women, right? That's all there were. There are 15 of them. They ended up in the front page of newspapers around the world the next day. This is savvy civic activism. And so kids need to see that stuff, right? They need to see that stuff. It's a fabulous story. Really, really creative. Emily, the first time I taught that story was in Charlotte, North Carolina. So the last thing I would say is that for educators, the most important thing is we're going to have to be learning and growing all the time, because somebody's going to come in with something and they're going to teach us something, and that has to be part of our disposition. So the very last thing I'm going to say is this. My colleague Carola Suarez Orozco is a gardener. I am not a gardener. I would kill a plant. But she reminds us that, the story of immigration, the story of migration is a lot like transplanting a plant into new soil. When a plant comes into a new soil, it immediately, for those of you who garden, it shrinks a little, right? It cuts back. If there's water, if there's nutrients in that soil, the plant's going to grow. If the soil is not rich, if people don't come take care of it, the plant is going to die. The metaphor is a little obvious. I'm not going to say any more. Think about your role there. So thank you for letting me talk at you for a little bit. That's not how I run a workshop. I'd much rather engage you all and talk with you all. I mean it. So the last thing I'm going to just say is that Reimagining is running a bunch of workshops over the summer, including a chance to come gather in person in Boston in late June. I would genuinely love for you all to come. We'll start sending out information about it really soon. All right, I'm shutting up. Thanks so much, Emily.
Workshops that I highly, highly recommend. I've been part of these workshops. As a presenter and as an attendee, and I've get so much out of this. Adam, I can listen to you for 2 more hours. I took so many notes, and I was asked if you're going to be sharing your presentation. We would love to have.
I'll send it to you right now.
All right, so he'll share it. If you can put it on the chat, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, learning. I think one of the areas that clicked right now for me is that so much of what you're saying right now is reaffirming of what I do in the classroom. I think I need to be challenged to get it out of my classroom into campus and community, because I just feel like I do a really good job within those 4 walls. And I just need to branch myself out to get this information to other teachers who may not have this knowledge, or may need some more guidance on how to work with newcomers. Lots of thank yous in the chat. So go in and take a look at it. Adam, how would you feel about going into a breakout session if anyone would have a Q&A? Would you be willing to do that? Because we usually, after the presenter, I am going to open up the break rooms so you can go by grade level, elementary, middle school, high school. So when I open them, go in there And before you go, let me share, and I know there's a lot being shared right now in the chat. So if it gets lost, let me know. But I just shared the link to that document that has our notes. So if you do go into an elementary, middle school, and high school room, please have someone, delegate someone to take notes and add those resources to the document. We have so much already there, but just scroll down to March and add today's notes about your discussion. If you choose to go to a Q&A with Adam, he's going to be there. He has specific questions maybe about his workshops or his presentation today. He'll be there and join you. I'm opening the break room session unless someone has a question that can benefit the whole group. We good? All right. Break rooms are open. Just hover down to break rooms. Scroll down or up to the side where it says the grade level and join that grade level for you to go to. If you don't see it, I'll be happy to send you there.
Emily, oh, I see it. Never mind.
You got it? All right, good. Adam, did you see it?
I don't see it.
Oh, he's gone. Okay, Adam's gone. So let me see. Got it. If you need help, let me know. I don't
see any break.
Okay, so let me find you where you are. Where do you want to go?
Elementary school.
Elementary. All right, bye.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.